thank you for allowing us to be here today. We praise you for your word. We praise you for the opportunity to serve you. I pray that you will give us clear minds and discerning minds as we go into your word, to be able to summarize it concisely and emphasize the things that you would have us emphasize. Let us shout where the Bible shouts and whisper where the Bible whispers. I thank you for this group, God. And we love you. In your name we pray. Amen.
Amen.
Okay, so we have spent... 5 weeks going through the Torah? Is that all? No, more than that. Far more than that. We spent 4 weeks going through Genesis, 2 weeks going through Exodus, and then 1 week covering Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Right, so that's 7 weeks total. This is week number 8, going through the story of the Bible. And today, we are going to really feel the pace quicken. Right, we felt that a little bit last week, but today we're going to feel it even more. Because last week we covered Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, but that, broadly speaking, only covered about 40 years worth of time. And most of the thing we were focusing on covered about 1 year of time, right? Their time at Mount Sinai. Today, however, we are going to be covering much more than 40 years. We are going to be covering what seems to be, what most scholars would agree, over 200 years of time. Because we are going to begin with Joshua guiding the people of Israel into the Promised Land. And we are going to be ending with the end of the book of Judges. And Lord willing, we'll actually get through the book of Ruth as well. Because Ruth is a very short book that we can summarize pretty quickly. Once again, I feel the need to emphasize this because since we spent so much time in Genesis, I don't want to give the false impression that these books are less important. The only reason we're going through them faster is because we're emphasizing the storyline of the Bible, and I'm trying to place an emphasis on the things that you really need to hold on to in order to understand the broader story. Right? So the book of Joshua, only really the first half of the book is actually narrative. Right? The back half of the book is actually more about boundary lines and stuff like that. And so we don't have to go into detail about that stuff. And also, I had warned y'all about this whenever we started Genesis. I said we were going to slow down at the beginning and then slowly but surely pick things up the more we got acclimated to the biblical worldview and stuff like that. And so now that we are well acquainted with the Bible and what it's emphasizing and stuff like that, that's kind of what we are placing our emphasis on, and so we can go a little bit quicker. So, that being said, all because we're covering this stuff quickly does not mean that we should just, if we're doing our personal Bible studies through it, that we should just breeze through it. Which hopefully you all should know, because on our Tuesday night group, we spent over half a year just going chapter by chapter through the book of Judges, right? And so we've been working through this very quickly. And so y'all should know that we just spent a lot of time in this. Yes?
I would like to add, the very first chapter that I went through with you guys was Judges.
Oh, was it?
When I first started going to the Bible study.
Oh, very cool.
Judges was the first.
And I remember it's the same thing, we had to start the cycle.
Yeah. Yeah, and so, so we could emphasize a lot more than we're going to emphasize today, but we're just going to emphasize the main story beats so that you understand the big picture stuff, because I think that both are valid, right? I think that we need to go in-depth in Scripture, but it's hard to go in-depth if you don't know the big picture stuff as well, because it's only really in light of the big picture stuff that the small details begin to really make sense, right? And you can understand this if you were to go outside, right? If you were paying attention to literally every single detail outside, you would be looking at every single little worm and ant crawling on the ground and following their every trajectory. But there's probably more important things you can focus on, right? I'm not saying that you should discount those details, but it's only in light of the bigger scope of things that you'll understand what you should direct attention to. And I would much rather you... if a car is driving in your direction down the road, I would much rather you take notice of the car driving in your direction down the road so you don't get run over, rather than the ant crawling across the street, right? And so the bigger context helps us understand the smaller details as well. So we enter into the book of Joshua, and I would highly encourage you to not focus too much on this AI art here, or else it'll very quickly begin to confuse you, because you'll notice that it's all sort of messed up. In regards to this dude has two right arms. One arm is going one direction, the other arm is going the opposite direction. He seems to be walking away from the camera, but his knees are facing this way, but his feet are also going the other way. There's just all sorts of weird things going on with this AI art, which just re-emphasizes the fact that artificial intelligence fails to capture what humans can accomplish. But we finished off last week with Deuteronomy and the death of Moses, and really Moses predicting everything that was going to happen going forward throughout the rest of Scripture and really the rest of history. And whenever Moses died, at the very end of Deuteronomy, these are the words we read. Now Joshua the son of Nun was filled with the spirit of wisdom, for Moses had laid his hands on him. And the sons of Israel listened to him and did as Yahweh had commanded Moses. Since that time, no prophet has arisen in Israel like Moses, whom Yahweh knew face to face. For all the signs and wonders which Yahweh sent him to perform in the land of Egypt against Pharaoh, all his servants, and all his land, and for all the mighty power and for the great terror which Moses performed in the sight of all Israel. So Moses dies up on a mount called Nebo, and God himself buries Moses' body, which is pretty cool. To this day, people don't know where the body of Moses was buried. But who does Moses leave in charge after? Joshua, right? And now, in order to understand the book of Joshua, it's probably best to step into Joshua's shoes in order to understand exactly where he's coming from. So Joshua has been Moses' right-hand man since the very beginning, right? From the weeks that they left Egypt, whenever the Amalekites went to attack Israel, if you remember, who was the one who led the Israelites into battle?
Was it Joshua?
It was Joshua, right? So the year that they left Egypt, Joshua was the man leading them into battle. I imagine at that time, Joshua was still a pretty young guy. Probably, I imagine he was in his early 20s, something like that. And he was equipped to go out into battle. And he led them, and he was their commander going forward, right? And so for 40 years, Joshua has been second in command to Moses, right? He has seen Moses be a faithful leader through 40 years, but in the midst of all that, he also got to see how stiff-necked the people are, right? He has gotten to see how bad these people can be, and in fact, he has gotten to reap the consequences of their stubbornness. Because if you remember, whenever Moses sent 12 spies into the land, do you know who one of those spies was? Joshua. Right? Joshua and another guy named Caleb, they came back and said, Yahweh can deliver this land into our hands. Let's go get it. The other 10 spies said they couldn't. The people went with the other 10 spies, and as a result, they were punished to wandering the wilderness for 40 years. So Joshua, he's been involved since the very beginning, and he knows how bad these people can be. He has spent 40 years in the desert with these people because of how stubborn they are. And now, Moses himself has died, and Joshua finds himself in a place where he is now in the position of authority. And that's already probably pretty intimidating, right? It's kind of like if you've been like the co-manager for your entire life, and then all of a sudden the manager, retires. Like you've seen them do things forever, but now you've got to step up to the plate, and all eyes are on you. And especially if you think about who Moses was, I mean, Moses did all these amazing, miraculous things, right? Moses single-handedly showed up 10 plagues on Egypt. They walked through parted seas. All this crazy stuff happened under Moses. That's a lot to live up to. And add to that the fact that these people have been slaves for hundreds of years, and the only person they've ever known how to follow is Moses, right? And so now Joshua, here he is, 40 years later, stepping into the reins, and that's already intimidating. Add to that the fact that now Joshua has to do what even Moses could not get the people to do. What is Joshua's primary task?
Leading the children of Israel into the promised land.
Yeah, he has got to lead the people into the promised land. Even Moses didn't do that, right? The people who had seen Moses do all these things did not believe that they could go into the land, right? And that's why they ended up getting punished for 40 years. Joshua knows this because he was one of the people who had said, no, we should go into the land. So Joshua knows how intimidating this task is ahead of him. And so I don't think it should be a surprise to us that whenever we actually get into the book of Joshua, and really at the end of Deuteronomy as well, time and time again, there is a 4-word encouragement that is given to Joshua. Be strong and courageous. Right? If you wanted to summarize the book of Joshua in 4 words, it would be those words. Be strong and courageous. Be strong and courageous. Be strong and courageous. Be strong and courageous. At the end of Deuteronomy, these are the words. that Moses says to Joshua. And at the beginning of Joshua, these are the words that Yahweh says to Joshua. Right? It says, Joshua, you need to be strong and courageous. Nowadays, we love to take these verses and we love to just kind of rip them out of context and apply them to ourselves. But you've got to realize that Joshua himself was facing this huge task that was hitherto just like unknown. Right? I mean, that there's so much weight on his shoulders. Right? I mean, the promise that was made to Abraham hundreds of years earlier is now going to be fulfilled through Joshua. Right? God had said, I will give this land to your seed. And for hundreds of years, the seed did not have the land. Joshua is the one who is responsible for bringing them in. And so this dude has every reason to be scared because he knows that these people are terrifying and he's got to take a band of slaves and turn them into fierce warriors. Mm-hmm. That's terrifying. Right? He knows how stiff-necked they are. He knows how rebellious they are. He knows how hard-hearted they are. And he knows how mighty the Philistines are, and he knows how quick the people are to abandon Yahweh. He's got a huge task ahead of them. But this is how the book of Joshua begins. Now it came about after the death of Moses, the servant of Yahweh, that Yahweh spoke to Joshua the son of Nun, Moses' servant, saying, Moses my servant is dead. Now therefore arise, cross this Jordan, you and all this people, to the land which I am giving to them, to the sons of Israel. Every place on which the sole of your foot treads, I have given it to you, just as I spoke to Moses. From the wilderness and this Lebanon, even as far as the great river, the river Euphrates, all the land of the Hittites, and as far as the great sea toward the setting of the sun, will be your territory. No man will be able to stand before you all the days of your life. Just as I have been with Moses, I will be with you. I will not fail you or forsake you. Be strong and courageous, for you shall give this people possession of the land which I swore to their fathers to give them. Only be strong and very courageous. Be careful to do according to all the law which Moses my servant commanded you. Do not turn from it to the right or to the left, so that you may have success wherever you go. This book of the law shall not depart from your mouth, but you shall meditate on it day and night, so that you may be careful to do according to all that is written in it. For then you will make your way prosperous, and then you will have success. Have I not commanded you? Be strong and courageous. Do not tremble or be dismayed, for Yahweh your God is with you wherever you go. Right? Once again, we love to quote these verses in regards to ourselves, but those words aren't written to us. This is Yahweh speaking to Joshua. And he says, Joshua, I gave Moses this Torah, and I told the sons of Israel to build their lives on the Torah, and if they built their lives on it, things would go well. The same is true for you. You're terrified of what's about to happen. Right? You are going to have to take these people, turn them into warriors, and go into this land and fight and conquer and bring into fulfillment the promise that I made. As long as you study the Torah, and as long as you apply yourself diligently to it, you have nothing to fear. But notice he doesn't say he will be successful. Like whenever he says success there, I want you to realize that this is why I try to emphasize that these verses are written to Joshua, not to us. Because whenever we read, this word of the law shall always be on your lips, and you will prosper in all that you do. Whenever we read prosper or success, we usually think of monetary gain or satisfaction. That's not what this is about. Whenever God tells Joshua he will be successful, what's he talking about?
That he's going to be able to successfully get them into the promised land?
Yeah, he will be able to successfully get them into the promised land. He will prosper in the task God has given him. Notice what he does not say. He does not say, as long as you have enough swords and have enough shields, and as long as you have the right number of battle formations, you will prosper. He says, as long as the Torah is always on your heart and on your lips, you will succeed. Right? So according to God, the way the land will be conquered is not through battle strategy, but through faithfulness. And sure enough, that is what we're going to see once we get into the story itself. We're going to summarize this very quickly. I'm just going to highlight just different exciting moments. So just how Moses sent 12 spies into the land, Joshua also begins by sending a few spies into the land. Right? He sends spies in, and do you know what the very first city they come to is? Jericho. Right? They come to a city named Jericho. If you're looking at the map right there, I know it's really small. But Jericho, if you just go north of the Dead Sea and a little bit to the east of the Jordan River, Jericho is right there. Right? So it's right across from the Jordan River. And so Joshua sends the spies in. They go to Jericho. And there they encounter a woman named Rahab. Right? Rahab is a prostitute. Rahab takes them in and conceals them because the people of Jericho and the people of Canaan at large, they know that the Israelites are across the Jordan. They have heard rumors of what the Israelites are coming to do. Right? They're terrified because they have heard all that Yahweh did for Israel back in Egypt and how God has provided for them in the wilderness these 40 years. So everybody's kind of terrified, and all the Canaanites are in this dreaded anticipation of this coming conquest by the Israelites. But Rahab, she seems to actually kind of convert a little bit. She has heard about what Yahweh has done and who Yahweh is, and she says, you know what? I would rather be on that guy's side than anybody else's. And so she decides to conceal the Israelite spies while everybody's out hunting for them. And she makes a deal with them and says, hey, whenever you come into the land and conquer the city, because we know you're going to be able to do it, can you just spare me and my family? And the spies, since she helped them out and stuff, they agree to do so. They tell her to just hang something out her window, scarlet thread or scarlet ribbon. And as long as that scarlet ribbon is outside the window, they will know which place to spare. And they will just conquer everything else, but she will be spared, right? Because of her faithfulness and the hesed that she has shown them. And so they do that, and then they flee back, and they report to Joshua everything that they've seen. When you get to Joshua chapter 3, the people of Israel have this momentous moment where they finally enter into the promised land. And this is what we read. Picking up in verse 7. Now Yahweh said to Joshua, this day I will begin to exalt you in the sight of all Israel, that they may know that just as I have been with Moses, I will be with you. You shall moreover command the priests who are carrying the ark of the covenant, saying, when you come to the edge of the waters of the Jordan, you shall stand still in the Jordan. Then Joshua said to the sons of Israel, come here and hear the words of Yahweh your God. Joshua said, by this you shall know that the living God is among you, and that he will assuredly dispossess from before you the Canaanite, the Hittite, the Hivite, the Perizzite, the Girgashite, the Amorite, and the Jebusite. Behold, the ark of the covenant of Yahweh, of the Lord of all the earth, is crossing over ahead of you into the Jordan. Now then, take for yourselves 12 men from the tribes of Israel, 1 man from each tribe. It shall come about, when the soles of the feet of the priests who carry the ark of Yahweh, the Lord of the earth, rest in the waters of the waters of the Jordan will be cut off, and the waters which are flowing down from above will stand in one heap. So, what's going to happen is that as they cross the Jordan River, they're going to have the Ark of the Covenant go in first. Right? The Ark of the Covenant is, once again, what is that?
It shows the presence of God.
It's the dwelling place of God.
Yeah.
Right? God himself dwells in the Ark of the Covenant. And so as they're carrying this, the moment they step into the Jordan River, what's going to happen?
The water's part.
Well, yeah, so the Jordan is going to stop flowing all of a sudden. Right? And where it was flowing, it's just going to stop and it's going to build up into one heap. What does that sound like?
Sounds like in Exodus, in the land of Egypt. Well, actually going out of Egypt, the Red Sea parting.
Yeah, it sounds like the parting of the Red Sea. Right? And so what's going to happen is that as they're going into the land, once again, there's going to be a new parting of the Red Sea. But it's the Jordan River, right? So since it's a river, it has a current. And so it's not going to pile up into two places. It's going to pile up into one place. And then the rest of the river will run dry. And then what's going to happen is that the Israelites are going to cross over on dry ground. Right? And God says the reason I'm going to do this is because I want to communicate to everybody else that I am with Joshua as I was with Moses. And so, just like they passed through the Red Sea on dry ground, they're going to pass into the Promised Land on dry ground as well. And so we read, so when the people set out from their tents to cross the Jordan, with the priests carrying the Ark of the Covenant before the people, and when those who carried the Ark came into the Jordan, and the feet of the priests carrying the Ark were dipped into the edge of the water, for the Jordan overflows all its banks all the days of the harvest. The waters which were flowing down from above and stood and rose up into one heap, a great distance at Adam, the city that is beside Zerathon. And those which were flowing down toward the sea of the Arabah, the salt sea, were completely cut off. So the people crossed opposite Jericho. And the priests who carried the Ark of the Covenant of the Yahweh stood firm on dry ground in the middle of the Jordan, while all Israel crossed on dry ground until the nation had finished crossing the Jordan. Ben, I don't know if you remember whenever we were in Israel, we went to a place where the Jordan River was at, and I got to preach a little message there. According to tradition, that is the place where they entered into the land.
I remember when you said that.
Yep. And so the people of Israel, like this is a really big moment, right? This land was promised to them hundreds of years earlier. They are about to own it, but you got to keep in mind, none of these people have actually stepped into the land prior to this moment, other than the spies, right? Up until this moment, it's just been a story that they've heard about for years, right? It's a story that their parents told them growing up. And it's a story that their parents' told them growing up. And it's a story that their parents' told them growing up, right? This is a story that had been handed down, that there was this land up north, the land of Canaan, that they would one day possess. But they never stepped there. But now, the Jordan River miraculously parts, and they step in to retrieve the land that God has given them. And so even this miraculous parting is God reaffirming the fact, hey, I am behind this, right? I will be with you, I will sustain you. And so, sure enough, whenever they get into the land, in Joshua chapter 4, the very first thing that they do is that they memorialize the place and they begin to worship God. Now when all the nation had finished crossing the Jordan, Yahweh spoke to Joshua, saying, take for yourselves 12 men from the people, 1 man from each tribe, and command them, saying, take up for yourselves 12 stones from here, out of the middle of the Jordan, from the place where the priest's feet are standing firm, and carry them over with you, and lay them down in the lodging place where you will lodge tonight. So Joshua called the 12 men whom he appointed from the sons of Israel, 1 man from each tribe. And Joshua said to them, cross again to the ark of Yahweh your God into the middle of the Jordan, and each of you take up a stone on his shoulder, according to the number of tribes of the sons of Israel. Let this be a sign among you, so that when your children ask later, saying, what do these stones mean to you? Then you shall say to them, because the waters of the Jordan were cut off before the ark of the covenant of Yahweh. When it crossed the Jordan, the waters of the Jordan were cut off. So these stones shall become a memorial to the sons of Israel forever. And so they go and they take these 12 stones, and then they begin to worship God here, and they set these stones up as a memorial to God. Let me see if there's anything else I need to mention right here. Going down to verse 19. Now the people came up from the Jordan on the 10th of the first month and camped at Gilgal on the east edge of Jericho. Those 12 stones which they had taken from the Jordan, Joshua set up at Gilgal. The name Gilgal means circle of stones. So it's, He said to the sons of Israel, when your children ask their fathers in time to come, saying, what are these stones? You shall inform your children, saying, Israel crossed this Jordan on dry ground. For Yahweh your God dried up the waters of the Jordan before you until you had crossed, just as Yahweh your God had done to the Red Sea, which he dried up before us until we had crossed, that all the peoples of the earth may know that the hand of Yahweh is mighty, so that you may fear Yahweh your God forever. The cool thing about Scripture is that it interprets itself. So a lot of the times, if you don't understand what's happening, the Bible will just explain to you what's happening. And so it says, hey, like if you're wondering, why do they need 12 stones? Well, it tells you. It says that you need the 12 stones so that you can set them up as a pillar, so that your children see the pillar and say, hey, what's the deal with those 12 stones? And you explain, oh, well, it represents what God did for us, right? And then it allows you to tell your history. It's kind of like for us over in, here in Texas, right? Whenever, one day when you have a, spouse and kids and you go to drive up to San Antonio and your kid says, what's that building right there in the center of the whole city? What is that? Well, that's the Alamo. Why does it look so different than the others? Well, it's because we want it to remind us of our history. We want to remember the Alamo, right? And they're like, well, what happened at the Alamo? And then as Texans, we tell them the story of, everything that happened at the Alamo. Well, same thing here, right? Or even a little bit closer, we have the San Jacinto Monument, right? Well, what's with that big obelisk and what's that standing there? Well, a battle was fought here. It was a very brief battle, but it was really important in Texas history, right? That's what these memorial stones represent, right? There's one for each tribe, so that one day whenever, some Israelite guy takes his kid for a walk past Gilgal, they say, what are those 12 stones there for? Well, you see, one day, like back in the day, us 12 tribes, we didn't live in this land. We lived in the land of Egypt. But God took us 12 tribes, and he took us through parted waters, through the Red Sea. And then he didn't leave us in the wilderness, but he took us through parted waters into the promised land. And that right there is where we camped when we got here, right? Gilgal, the circle of stones, right? And so these memorials are supposed to do just that. They're supposed to be a memorial for the people, to remind them of their history. Whenever you get to chapter 5, we see the people preparing for their conquest. And so what God needs to have them do is he needs to make sure that they're actually being faithful to him. And if you remember, whenever Moses was going down to deliver the people from bondage, after he met God at the burning bush and was going down to Egypt, God had gotten mad at him about something that he had failed to do. Do you remember what that was?
This was at the burning bush?
After the burning bush. So he left Mount Sinai, he's going down to Egypt, he's traveling with his wife and his child, and there's something he'd forgotten to do.
Wasn't it circumcise his kid?
He'd forgotten to circumcise his kid. And so God got mad at him about that, remember?
Oh, yeah, I remember. Yeah.
And the reason why is because circumcision is like the most basic thing you can do as a disciple of Yahweh, right? In many ways, it's almost like us with baptism, right? It's like, okay, how can you expect to walk in obedience if you haven't even done like what we would consider the first act of obedience? Well, being a follower of Yahweh, circumcision was the sign of the Abrahamic covenant. And so God got mad at Moses for not doing that. Well, here we have the same thing happen, right? To where God, I don't think it says that God was mad or anything like that. But what they realize is they need to make sure that everybody is all the men are circumcised before they go conquer the land, because they need to make sure that if the whole goal of this is to be faithful to Yahweh and to serve Yahweh, it doesn't do any good if they're not actually doing that, right? I mean, they have to start faithful, right? You can't end faithful if you're not at least beginning the whole process correctly, right? You're not laying a good foundation for yourself as a nation. That makes sense? And so the people get circumcised. What's that?
Have a good foundation.
Oh, yes. A good foundation for sure. And so what they do is they have everybody get circumcised. They celebrate the Passover. And then when you get to Joshua chapter 6, the conquest actually begins. And sure enough, the very first city that they go and conquer is the city of Jericho. This is the most famous story that you have of the story of Joshua. But that's just because it's the first city they came across, right? So they crossed the Jordan, they're encamped at Gilgal, and they're sure enough going to go against Jericho and fight against it. But in order to set up this story, I just want to highlight something that I think is pretty cool. The end of Joshua chapter 5. Now it came about when Joshua was by Jericho that he lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, a man was standing opposite him with his sword drawn in his hand. And Joshua went to him and said to him, "Are you for us or for our adversaries?" He said, "No. Rather, I indeed come now as a captain of the Lord, of the host of Yahweh." And Joshua fell on his face to the earth and bowed down and said to him, "What is my Lord to say to his servant?" The captain of Yahweh's host said to Joshua, "Remove your sandals from your feet, for the place where you are standing is holy." And Joshua did so. What does that seem to call back to?
Moses at the burning bush.
Moses at the burning bush.
When God told him.
Yeah. And so once again, we see that Joshua is kind of following in the footsteps of Moses here. And that's what sets the groundwork for the conquering of Jericho. And you're probably familiar with the story of the conquering of Jericho. What ends up happening is that the people go out there, they circle the city once each day for 7 days, but then on the last day they circle it 7 times. And then what do they do after the 7th time?
They shout with an exceedingly great shout.
Yep, they blow the trumpets, they shout at the top of their lungs, and then what happens?
The walls come a tumbling down.
The walls come a tumbling down. Yeah, so this battle is won miraculously, right? I would, as you're going to notice, there aren't really any other battles that they fight in this exact manner. But they don't really need to. Why is it that this battle has to happen this way, you think? What is God trying to communicate to them?
He's setting the standard that whenever you're going in and you're going to battle and conquer all these lands, that it's not your own power that's doing it, but it's God that's bringing them through and being able to fight for them.
Exactly. Right? Not by strength, nor by power, but by my spirit, declares Yahweh. Right? Some trust in chariots and some trust in horses, but we will trust in the name of Yahweh of hosts. Right? So what's being communicated in this first battle is that God does not need a big army. In fact, God doesn't even need you to raise your sword. All God needs you to do is shout his praises, and he can bring those walls come tumbling down. Right? And so the walls come falling, and then Israel, they raid, they loot the place, they conquer it, and Jericho becomes their very first big claim to fame. And basically the message is, be faithful, and if you're faithful, everything will go well. Right? And so that's why that has to go down that way, because God doesn't want them to think that he needs them to conquer this, right? It's all about them focusing on him. And there's a lot we could talk about over the course of these next chapters, right? Chapter 7, Israel actually is defeated in a battle, but then they come back in chapter 8 to win, right? The city of Ai. In chapter 9, there is these people known as the Gibeonites, and they make they're very tricky, right? Have you ever heard of the story of the Gibeonites? Where they basically, they live very nearby. Like, Gibeon is not that far from where the Israelites are currently at. Like, once again, you can even see it on the map right there if you were to look closely. But Gibeon, it is in the land of what is going to be the tribe of Benjamin. And the Gibeonites, they come over to visit the Israelites, and they act like they're from a very distant land.
Yeah.
Right? And they say, oh, we're here to make a peace with you because we've heard of all these amazing things that you've done. The issue is, the Israelites have been commanded by God not to make peace with anybody in the land. But the Israelites don't realize that the Gibeonites are from the land, and so they mistakenly make peace with them. And then it turns out that the Gibeonites, were from in the land, and so there's this whole kerfluffle over it and saying like, oh, we shouldn't have made an oath with you, but we did, and so we're going to be faithful to it. And it's very interesting, but for the sake of time, we'll blaze past it, right? Just the idea is that we're getting to see a little bit of the dynamic of what's going on in the land at this time. But really, over the course of Joshua chapters 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, and 12, we get to see the conquering of the land, right? So we just get to hear battle after battle after battle, and we don't have to go super in-depth into it for the sake of time, but we get to see the conquest of the land moment by moment by moment. And by the time we reach the end of the book of Joshua, the land is not entirely conquered, but it has been conquered to a good enough degree that we can be satisfied that it is now the land of Israel, if that makes sense. The land really isn't going to be fully conquered until you get to the time period of David, right? David is going to be the one who really finally seems to wipe all the people out so that all the cities are really, like the conquest is finished in David. But Joshua is the one who really, he gets the credit for the conquest because he's the one who sets it in motion and really makes it the land of Israel rather than the land of Canaan, right? And then when you get to Joshua chapters 13 through, what is it? Chapter 13, 14, 15, 16. It just keeps going for a while. Let me see where it even stops. 18, 19, 20, 21, 22. So through chapter 21. Yeah. So from chapters 13 through 21, you get to see what many people would probably consider some of the most boring chapters in the entire Bible. And I would encourage you to not look at it that way. But if you're going to those chapters for entertainment value and you're just wanting like a really exciting narrative, it will disappoint you. Because whenever you get to these sections, this is where it says, all right, and the border of Benjamin started here, and it moved east until it hit this river, and then it went southeast until it got here, and then it went up northeast until it hit here. And then from this tree, it goes up north, and then it goes and cuts right. And if you're reading it, it's going to be very boring. But I don't want you to miss how important these chapters would have been to the original audience, right? Because what is the purpose of these chapters for the original audience?
Shows God's provision and His faithfulness.
Yeah, it shows God's provision, and it shows them the inheritance that their families receive, right? If you are a person of the tribe of Judah, you are learning exactly where you are going to live for future generations, right? This is very, very significant, right? You are learning about what your culture is going to be like, right? It's super significant whenever you just consider all of that. For us, we don't find it compelling just because we read things from a very selfish point of view, right? Oh, what does this have to do with me? We shouldn't do that, right? These chapters are super significant because here we actually get to see, hey, can somebody get the door for me? Here in these chapters, we get to see that God has been faithful and He has fulfilled His covenant. And He is actually giving the people the land that He promised them. Hey, Maverick. And so, you read these chapters, you might find them kind of boring, because it really is just in the form of a list. But what we get to see here is that the land that the Israelites were promised for hundreds of years is finally theirs. Right? And if you look at it from that perspective, that's really cool. Because if you remember, Abraham, he only owned one piece of land. Right? He owned the cave of Machpelah. That was it. But now, you've got the people of Judah, they have all this land. Simeon, all this land. Dan, Ephraim, Manasseh, Reuben, Gad, East Manasseh, all these. They own all this land. When you're looking at the map here, you will notice that the tribes of Reuben, Gad, and the half tribe of Manasseh, they are actually encamped on the eastern side of the... I just realized whenever I was talking about Jericho earlier, I meant to say I was on the western side of the Jordan, not the eastern. But Gad, Reuben, and the half tribe of Manasseh, those are on the eastern side of the Jordan River. You see that? That was not originally part of the plan. Right? If you actually go back to the Torah, I believe it's in the book of Numbers, you get to read about this story, where basically they were saying, hey, we would like these tribes. We would like this area of land. And Moses actually argued with them about it. And he said, no, y'all only want this land because y'all are scaredy cats who are afraid to go in and fight with your brethren for the land. But the 2.5 tribes said, well, no, we will go in there and we will fight for the land. We just really like this real estate. And so Moses reluctantly agreed. But there are going to be negative ramifications about this in Israel's history. Because even though the Jordan River is a very tiny river, from like our perspective, right? I mean, you got to realize that in Israel, everything is like shrunken, right? I mean, for us, whenever we think of a river, we think like a big, thick river. If you go see the Jordan River in Israel, it's what we would consider a creek in Texas, right? So the Jordan River is not huge, but it still is a natural barrier, right? And so there is now this sort of division in the land where you've got 9.5 tribes dwelling over here, and then 2.5 tribes dwelling over here. And that's going to affect things. It won't affect things to a dramatic degree, but it still will be there nonetheless. But that's why you see 2.5 tribes dwelling where they're dwelling over there. And so you read through these chapters, and you get to see the land divided, and you might find it narratively boring, but covenantally speaking, this is a huge deal. Because after hundreds of years of waiting, they no longer have just the cave of Machpelah, right? They now own all of it. Right? And yes, they still have more cities to conquer and more people to push out, but by and large, they've taken the land of Canaan. And there would be some chapters in here that I imagine some people will push back against. I won't imagine it. People do push back against it. And they'll say that God was being way too brutal with the Canaanites and stuff like that. I would just encourage you as a Christian to not be embarrassed of what God has commanded. Right? Yes, there are some chapters that you might read it and you might be like, whoa, that is intense. I can't believe God did that. Well, you better start believing it, right? God can do what he wants, and the rest of the Bible testifies to the fact that God is good. And so if your brain cannot grasp God's goodness, even in these things that we would deem kind of sketchy, that's okay, because his mind is better than ours, right? And his ways are higher than our ways. And so by the end of the book of Joshua, this is kind of what we're looking at on this map right here, right? Joshua has been strong. He has been courageous. He has brought the people into the land. The land has been divided. But before the people divide out, Joshua needs them to do something. Because Joshua recognizes that there is a huge, huge, huge task ahead of them. Because thus far, remember, Joshua has seen how stubborn these people can be. Right? He has seen how hard-hearted they are. He has seen how quick they are to turn from God. Right? He was there with Moses on Mount Sinai whenever the people turned and worshiped the golden calf. Remember that?
Yes.
So Joshua knows this. He knows how hard it is for them to worship God when they're all encamped together at the foot of a mountain where God's presence is clearly seen. Do you know how much harder it's going to be for them to be faithful whenever they're not encamped together and God's presence isn't clearly seen? Compare going to church on Sunday versus being at home by yourself. Right? Whenever you're at church on Sunday, it's easy to sing God's praises and it's easy to focus on God because you're surrounded by like-minded people who are literally gathered to worship God.
Yeah.
But whenever you go home, well, there's all sorts of distractions that can tempt you away from God and do this and do that. Or whenever you're going out and doing whatever, right? It gets a lot harder. Joshua knows this. And he knows that the people have struggled even whenever God has literally made himself well known to them. Right? God's presence dwelling on a mountain. Right? His words have been spoken from the mountain. What do the people do? They worship a golden calf. Joshua knows that these people have already failed. And it's going to get a lot harder. And so, before the people actually split up, now that Joshua has delivered them into the land, he gives his farewell address. Right? That's what you read in Joshua chapter 23. And then in Joshua chapter 24, what he's going to do is he is going to give them a commission. And he's going to begin by recapping their history, which is going to lead into these verses right here. Let me start with verse 1 in chapter 24, and eventually we'll catch up with what we read here. Then Joshua gathered all the tribes of Israel to Shechem, and called for the elders of Israel, and for their heads, and their judges, and their officers. And they presented themselves before God. Joshua said to all the people, "Thus says Yahweh, the God of Israel, from ancient times your fathers lived beyond the river, namely Terah, the father of Abraham and the father of Nahor, and they served other gods. Then I took your father Abraham from beyond the river, and led him through all the land of Canaan, and multiplied his seed, and gave him Isaac. To Isaac I gave Jacob and Esau, and to Esau I gave Mount Seir to possess it. But Jacob and his sons went down to Egypt. Then I sent Moses and Aaron, and I plagued Egypt by what I did in its midst. And afterward I brought you out. I brought your fathers out of Egypt, and you came to the sea. And Egypt pursued your fathers with chariots and horsemen to the Red Sea. But when they cried out to Yahweh, he put darkness between you and the Egyptians, and brought the sea upon them, and covered them. And your own eyes saw what I did in Egypt, and you lived in the wilderness for a long time. Then I brought you into the land of the Amorites who lived beyond the Jordan, and they fought with you. And I gave them into your hand, and you took possession of their land when I destroyed them before you. Then Balak the son of Zippor, king of Moab, arose and fought against Israel, and he sent and summoned Balaam son of Beor to curse you. But I was not willing to listen to Balaam. So he had to bless you, and I delivered you from his hand." That's a story that we read about in the book of Numbers. We didn't talk about it last week, but it's a pretty cool story. "You crossed the Jordan and came to Jericho, and the citizens of Jericho fought against you, and the Amorite, and the Perizzite, and the Canaanite, and the Hittite, and the Girgashite, the Hivite, and the Jebusite. Thus I gave them into your hand. Then I sent the hornet before you, and it drove out the 2 kings of the Amorites from before you, but not by your sword or your bow. I gave you a land on which you had not labored, and cities which you had not built, and you have lived in them. You are eating of vineyards and olive groves which you did not plant." Right? So what God is emphasizing is he says, I took you from nothing and I gave you everything. Right? Those vineyards that you eat from now, you didn't plant those. Right? No. I have allowed other people hundreds of years of setting up this land for you. And now it is yours for the taking. And then Joshua says these words. "So now, fear Yahweh and serve him in integrity and truth, and put away the gods which your fathers served beyond the river and in Egypt, and serve Yahweh. If it is evil in your sight to serve Yahweh, choose for yourselves today whom you will serve, whether the gods which your fathers served, which were beyond the river, or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you are living. But as for me and my house, we will serve Yahweh." So what Joshua says, he says, guys, you have seen what God has done for you, right? What God promised to Abraham has been fulfilled before your very eyes, which means that we're at a big moment because y'all are about to disperse and you are about to go back to your homes and you are about to build a family. And we are no longer going to be all encamped in the wilderness around the tabernacle. You're going to go to your home. You're going to go to your home. You're going to go to your home. So right now, before we depart, while we're gathered here at Shechem, it is time for you to decide whom you're going to serve. This day, right? You can't wait till tomorrow. You can't wait till the next day. Don't push it off. Choose this day whom you will serve. Are you going to serve the gods of your fathers? Right? All those pagan gods? Or are you going to serve Yahweh? The idea is if you're going to serve anybody but Yahweh, get out of here because this land is not for you. Right? Yahweh has given you this land, and so you better serve him. If you're not going to, get out now. Because if you do choose to serve Yahweh and you stray, then we are holding you accountable for that. Choose this day whom you will serve. As for me and my house, we will serve Yahweh. So he says, this is what we're going to do. Now the choice is up to you. What are y'all going to do? And this is how the people respond. And the people answered and said, far be it from us that we should forsake Yahweh to serve other gods. For Yahweh our God is he who brought us and our fathers up out of the land of Egypt from the house of slavery, and who did these great signs in our sight and kept us through all the way in which we went and among all the peoples through whose midst we passed. And Yahweh drove out from before us all the peoples, and even the Amorites who lived in the land. We also will serve Yahweh, for he is our God. It's very similar to how Peter responds to Jesus whenever Jesus says, are you going to leave? And Peter says, to whom shall we go? You have the words of life. The people respond and they say, who else are we going to serve? Yahweh has given us everything. We will serve Yahweh. Far be it from us to go to other gods. We're not going to do that. Yahweh's given us everything. Of course we're going to serve him. That's our choice. There's no question about it. We will serve Yahweh. We will serve Yahweh. We will serve Yahweh. In many ways, I like to view the end of Joshua through the lens of Braveheart. You know the movie Braveheart?
I haven't heard of it.
Braveheart, probably the best thing about Braveheart, the thing it's most well known for, is the rallying speeches before a battle. Joshua, he has led the people through a conquest, but he realizes that the greatest battle is still before them. Right? The battle that they face is not a battle of flesh and bone, right? Because God's going to win those battles for them as long as they're faithful. The actual battle they face is a battle of spirit, right? It is a battle of faithfulness. And so what Joshua is doing here is he is giving them a rallying cry, right? They may take our lives, but they will never take our freedom, right? That's what Joshua is doing right here, right? Yes?
It's like, and have you all seen Kung Fu Panda 2?
I have not.
You've not? Okay, then it won't apply then because you haven't seen it.
Okay.
But there's something that has to do with
Okay,
what we're talking
cool.
about.
But no, so Joshua, he's gotten the people together, and he is saying, guys, look at what Yahweh has given us. Right now, in this moment, right here, you must choose whom you will serve. But as for me and my house, we will serve Yahweh. And everybody responds like soldiers in the midst of a battle. We will serve Yahweh. We will serve Yahweh. And the way the book of Joshua ends is on one of the most positive notes you can ever imagine. Right? The covenant is on the verge of being fulfilled. The people are dwelling in the land. They are going out to reap the benefits of all the good things God has given them. And they have their hearts set on faithfulness. We will serve Yahweh. We will serve Yahweh. We will serve Yahweh. And then, if this were a TV show or a movie, the scene would cut to black. You would flip to the book of Judges. And the narrator says, they did not. When you get to the book of Judges, things have taken a turn for the worse. It's really sad. Right? I mean, if this were a TV show, you would be startled by how different one season is from the next. Right? Because here, it's like, you've got this, like, I don't know, I guess if we're just going, each book of the Bible is a season, right? Joshua is season number 6, right? And season number 6 ended on the most positive note ever, where the people have finally gotten over their stiff-neckedness. They have finally received the fulfillment of the covenant that was promised in season 1, and they have finally said, we're going to serve Yahweh. And then whenever you flip the page and you go into the story of the Bible, season 7, you open up in a dark alleyway where there's all these criminals just lurking around, getting ready to rip somebody off. And there's sin rampant everywhere. And you think that maybe you're in a pagan city, but you're not in a pagan city. No, you are in the Holy Land. The land where you just saw at the end of the last season how bad, how good things were, and you're wondering, how the heck did we get here? And it's like, ooh. Yeah, no, so if I were to make a movie on the book of Judges, I would probably start at the end of Judges with the story of the Levite and his concubine in the city of Gibeah. Right? To where it almost looks like a replay of the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. And you think you're getting a flashback to the Sodom and Gomorrah story of Genesis, but you're not. Instead, you're seeing something take place from the people of Israel. And then it cuts to the credits and you flash back to see how we got there. The book of Judges, as I describe it on here, is a downward spiral. Things go from bad to worse, to bad to worse, to bad to worse. At the end of Joshua, they all promise their allegiance. They say they're going to follow Yahweh with all they've got. When you get to Judges, you realize that's not how it's going to go. And it all starts with just one tiny little error. Judges chapter 1. Now it came about after the death of Joshua that the sons of Israel inquired of Yahweh, saying, who shall go up first for us against the Canaanites to fight against them? And Yahweh said, Judah shall go up. Behold, I have given the land into his hand. Then Judah said to Simeon his brother, come up with me into the territory allotted to me, that we may fight against the Canaanites, and I in turn will go with you into the territory allotted to you. When you read that, it doesn't immediately seem like anything's bad. But you'll notice that Judah didn't listen exactly to what God had said. Right? So after Joshua dies, they still have more land to conquer, and they say, hey God, who should lead us? And God says, Judah should. Because if you go back to Genesis, remember it said, the scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet. Right? So Judah is the leading tribe. And so Judah should lead them into battle. But Judah doesn't do it alone, does he? He goes over to Simeon and says, hey, Simeon, join me. Right? You help me conquer my land, I'll help you conquer yours. That's not what God said. Right? And it's like, I mean, what they're doing is logical. Right? I mean, it doesn't seem like a huge disobedience. Right? He's just asking for help. It seems like a practical thing to do. But it's not what God said. And what we're going to see is that right here, we have a seed of error that's going to snowball into just terrible, terrible, licentious destruction at the end of the book. Right? What begins in Judges chapter 1 as just a moment of slight disobedience and not taking God's word as seriously as they ought is going to culminate in Judges 21, there's going to be civil war. Right? And basically an entire tribe is going to be nearly wiped out. And so it starts with something small, but it's a slow fade. Right? Yeah, if you know the Casting Crowns song. Right? So it starts here, and as you read through Judges, slowly but surely things get worse and worse and worse. By the end of Judges chapter 1, you get to see that as the people are conquering the land, they're not doing what God said. Right? In some cities, they're wiping out everybody like they were told to. But in other cities, they just enslave the people. Right? In other cities, they just leave unconquered altogether. Well, that's a problem. Because you might think that they're just thinking, oh, we're just being gracious. We don't want to kill them. We'll just make them slaves. That sounds gracious. But the whole reason God told them to kill them is because he knew that these people would be an influence on them. And he knew these people would lead them into idolatry. And that's what's going to happen. Right? And so, by the end of Judges chapter 1, we get to realize things are not going as good as anticipated. Which then leads to Judges chapter 2, where we basically have the whole outline of the book laid out for us. Judges chapter 2 basically tells us that going forward in this time period of history, there's going to be a cycle. Right? The people are going to be at the height of their prosperity, and just like Moses predicted in Deuteronomy 32, which we covered last week, if you remember. Remember when it says they grew fat and kicked? Do you remember that? That's the imagery it uses in Deuteronomy 32. Well, whenever they're at the height of prosperity, what the people of Israel are going to do is they are going to turn to other gods. And they are going to worship the pagan idols of the surrounding nations. And so, since God is mad at them for this because they have violated his covenant, what he's going to do is he is going to allow them to be oppressed by foreign people. Right? The rules of the covenant were that if you are faithful to me, you will prosper in the land. If you are unfaithful, I will discipline you as a father does his son. Well, since they are being unfaithful, he is going to allow them to be oppressed, and he will allow them to be oppressed until they are almost destroyed. But then finally, they will soften their hearts and repent, they will cry out to God, and he will raise up a person to deliver them. And this person is what we call a judge. Right? Whenever you think of the word judge, you typically think of a person with like a white wig on and a gavel. That's not exactly what it has in mind here, though the person isn't beyond that job, right? He does like the judges do preside over political things as well. But whenever you think of the word judge, I want you to think of judgment, right? In the sense of they wage judgment, right? These are like the champions of Greek mythology, right? The heroes, right? That's what these people are like. And so over the course of Judges, we have this cycle repeated again and again. But I want you to think of it, instead of just a circle, I want you to think of it like a slinky that's been stretched out, right? So it starts here, and the circle gets lower and lower and lower and lower, right? So we start off, and as we read through the book of Judges, some of the first judges are going to look pretty good. But by the time you get to the last judge, Samson, it's remarkable that God can even use this guy to save the people, right? Because the earlier judges, they're at least faithful to Yahweh, and they seem like pretty good people. But by the time you get to the end of this book, you're going to see that these people are like, they are a lost cause, to where even their heroes are corrupt. Which then leads us into an outline of the book, right? So chapter 1 gives us the political background. Chapter 2 gives us the spiritual background. And then chapters 3 through 16 are it's the judges cycle, right? And one thing you need to realize about chapter 3 through 21 is that this is not inherently a chronological story. To where we don't necessarily have to suggest that Othniel was before Ehud, and Ehud before Deborah, and Deborah before Gideon. This is not organized chronologically speaking, because if you did the math and actually added up each of these people's reigns, the time that they judged, their ministry, I guess you could say, if you added up the time of their ministry like sequentially, it would be like 400 something years. But we know the period of judges lasted about 200-ish years. And so there are probably times where one judge is ruling at the same time as another, right? And so some of them overlap, right? So we're not dealing chronologically, we're dealing thematically. What the author has done is they are communicating something about the people of Israel through the progression of the story. So they're starting off with a dude who is a really good guy, and they're watching the judges themselves deteriorate with the culture, if that makes sense. And then chapters 17 through 21 are just going to share basically a sequence of events and just different vignettes and stories that show you how the culture at large has been corrupted, specifically the priestly culture, right? So not only have the people been corrupted, but the priests themselves have. One thing I didn't highlight with Joshua is that if you were looking at the map, you would have noticed that there was no land ascribed to the tribe of Levi. Why is that?
Because they're the priestly line.
Exactly.
Leviticus.
Yeah. So if you remember, Jacob had how many sons? 12 sons, right? But there isn't a tribe of Joseph, right? Because do you remember what happened with Joseph?
I think he got 2.
He got 2 tribes, right? Because of all the stuff he'd gone through and because he was Jacob's favorite, he ends up getting 2 tribes. And so if you do 12 minus 1, right?
11.
That's 11. And then you have Ephraim and Manasseh, Joseph's 2 sons, who are put in there. So that's 11 plus 2, which is what? 11 plus 2. 13, right? So you would think that there should be 13 tribes of Israel, but that's not the case, right? There technically are 13 tribes, but that's not how it's described. Because whenever you actually look at the land, only 12 of them actually get a land allotment. Because one of those tribes, the Levites, they become the priestly tribe. And so rather than getting their own piece of land, they have cities in all the different lands, right? Because there need to be priests throughout the land of Israel to minister to the different tribes, right? And so whenever you're looking at it, that's where the 13th tribe went, right? The Levites are throughout the land. And so chapters 17 through 21 are going to focus on the Levites and how even the priests themselves have been corrupted. Another thing worth highlighting is that there are other judges that are mentioned in these in chapters 3 through 16. I just highlighted on here the ones that attention is drawn to, because sometimes there are judges mentioned who their whole ministry is described in one verse, right? And so let's walk through these. We're not going to spend a whole long time on them, just for the sake of time. But whenever you get to chapter 3, we read about the very first judge named Othniel, starting in verse 9. When the sons of Israel cried to Yahweh, Yahweh raised up a deliverer from the sons of Israel to deliver them. Othniel, the son of Kenaz, Caleb's younger brother. Who is Caleb?
One of the spies along with Joshua.
Yes. So whenever those 12 spies were originally sent into the land, Joshua and Caleb were the only two spies who brought back a good report about the land. And therefore, Joshua and Caleb were the only two men who were allowed to enter into the promised land. Right? Everybody else in the previous generation died. Well, Othniel, he's related to Caleb. So right off the bat, by association, what do we probably think about Othniel? Good or bad guy? Good. Probably a pretty good dude, right? He's related to Othniel. That's a really good sign. The Spirit of Yahweh came upon him, and he judged Israel. When he went out to war, Yahweh gave Cushan-Rishathaim, king of Mesopotamia, into his hand, so that he prevailed over Cushan-Rishathaim. Then the land had rested 40 years, and Othniel, son of Kenaz, died. Right, so Othniel, we don't really read much about him other than the fact that he was related to Caleb and that he delivered the people from their first oppressors, which are the Mesopotamians. Right? The next judge we read about is in the back half of chapter 3. In Ehud, this is a very fun story. Basically, the Moabites, if you're going east of the Dead Sea, that's where Moab's from. The Moabites were oppressing Israel at this time period. And once again, why is God allowing the people to be oppressed?
Because of their sin and idolatry.
Because of their idolatry. Mm-hmm. Right? And so the people are being oppressed once again because of their idolatry. And God raises up Ehud after the people repent and they cry out to him. God raised up Ehud to deliver them. And the way it goes about is this. We read that Ehud is from the tribe of Benjamin, which means what? What does Benjamin mean?
Son of my right hand.
Son of my right hand. But ironically, Ehud is a left-handed man. Right? So he's from the son of my right-handers, but he's a left-handed guy. And this is important in the story because he is going to end up assassinating the king of Moab. Right? The way he does it, though, is by strapping his knife to his right leg. Most people are right-handed, and so whenever you are going through customs or something like that, if they're just patting you down real quick, they would typically check your right side, right? Because if you're your left side. Because if you're right-handed, you would draw your sword from your left side, right? But this guy's left-handed, so he's got a trick up his sleeve, quite literally. And so what happens is that the people who were vassals of the Moabites, they had to bring tribute to the king. Tribute basically just means you have to bring money to him. And so Ehud is the guy to go do this, right? Ehud goes, he brings the money before the king, and he tells King Ehud, oh, by the way, I have a special message for you, a secret message, in fact. And the king, his name is Eglon. He's a very, very fat man. He says, ooh, a secret message. I would love to hear this. And so he gives Ehud a private audience, and Ehud says, the secret message I have for you is a message from Yahweh. And he draws out his sword, and he plunges the sword into Eglon's belly. And Eglon is such a fat man that the sword plunges all the way in, and the man's fat falls over the hilt so that you can't even see the sword anymore. Which is, that's a pretty fat guy. And then, to make matters worse, it says that the guy poops himself. Which is typically, that's something that just happens when you die. Your muscles relax. I would highly encourage you to die on an empty stomach if you don't want to embarrass yourself. But this guy, basically this whole text is kind of just emphasizing the embarrassment that Eglon faced. And so Ehud ends up delivering Israel by stabbing Eglon the fat king. And then Ehud escapes, and there's this huge battle, and once again the people are delivered. And that's kind of how this whole book of Judges goes. Right? You just get to hear all these amazing, really cool, very memorable stories from this time period. And I think the reason they're so memorable is because the people are so sinful that they keep getting put in very strange situations. Right? And so as a result, their deliverance is very strange. And it's kind of gross in a way. Right? I mean, being delivered by Moses through 10 plagues upon Egypt, that sounds cool. Being delivered by a dude who plunged a sword into a fat king and making the king poop himself, I mean, it makes for a cool story, but it's not like, there's not much dignity behind it. But Othniel and Ehud, they're both really cool. And so is Deborah, right? Deborah is going to be the next judge we read about, chapters 4 and 5. And Deborah, first off, by her name, what do you notice?
She's a female judge?
She's a female, right? Deborah is the only female judge we read about. and she's pretty cool. What we read about is that during the time period of Deborah, the Canaanites begin to oppress Israel because once again, Israel has turned away from God. Shocker, right? So Israel turns away from God. We get to Deborah, and Deborah is probably the most like whenever we think of the word judge nowadays, like judicially speaking, Deborah's probably the closest to that we see, because we literally see her like presiding over cases where like she sits underneath a tree, people come to her, they give her their problems, and she tells them what to do, right? So Deborah seems not only to be a majestic hero figure, but she also seems to be very wise. Well, the Canaanites come to oppress the people, and basically, this is what we read God saying to Deborah. This is verse 4 of chapter 4. Now Deborah, a prophetess, the wife of Lapidoth, was judging Israel at that time. She used to sit under the palm tree of Deborah between Ramah and Bethel in the hill country of Ephraim, and the sons of Israel came up to her for judgment. Now she sent and summoned Barak, the son of Abinoam, from Kadesh Naphtali, and said to him, Behold, Yahweh, the God of Israel, has commanded, Go and march to Mount Tabor, and take with you 10,000 men from the sons of Naphtali and from the sons of Zebulun. I will draw out to you Sisera, the commander of Jabin's army, with his chariots and his many troops to the river of Kishon, and I will give him into your hand. Then Barak said to her, If you will go with me, then I will go. But if you will not go with me, I will not go. She said, I will surely go with you. Nevertheless, the honor shall not be yours on the journey that you are about to take. For Yahweh will sell Sisera into the hands of a woman. Then Deborah arose and went to Barak to Kadesh. Barak called Zebulun and Naphtali together to Kadesh, and 10,000 men went up with him. Deborah also went with him. So, what we read here is that Deborah has been told by God that there's going to be a man to deliver them from the Canaanites. This man's name is Barak. Right? So she calls for Barak, says, Hey Barak, God has called for you to go and deliver the people from the Canaanites. And the Canaanites commander, his name is Sisera. Right? So she says, Barak, your job is going to be to deliver us from Sisera. But Barak is terrified. Because one thing that we read about is that the Canaanites, they have a lot of chariots. Right? And you know who does not have a lot of chariots? Israel. Right? The Israelites, why would they have a bunch of chariots? Right? I mean, they're slaves. Right? They were slaves who were just conquering the land. Right? They don't have any chariots. And do you know how intimidating it would be to go up against like a bunch of chariots? And so Barak says, you know what? Deborah, if you go with me, then I'll go fight this battle. But if you don't go, I'm not going either. Right? So Barak makes it clear that he doesn't really trust in God as much as he probably should. Who does he trust in?
I guess he's trying to do it on his own, so is he trusting in himself?
No. Who's he trusting in? Who does he want to go with him?
Oh, wait. And... Actually, I forgot who it was.
Deborah. Right? Deborah. He says, if you go with me, I'll go. If you don't go with me, I won't go. In many ways, he's treating Deborah how people are going to treat the Ark of the Covenant when we get to 1 Samuel. Right? It's almost like he's treating Deborah like a magic, like a magic totem. Right? Oh, if Deborah's with us, we'll win the battle. But if Deborah's not, we won't win the battle. So he's not trusting in Yahweh. He's trusting in the judge of Yahweh. He thinks that she needs to be there, and if she's not there, they can't win. Well, that's a bit of a problem. Right? And so Deborah responds and says, okay, I'll go with you, and you'll win the battle, but I'm just going to give you a heads up. If I go with you, your glory is going to go to a woman. And when you read the story, who are you supposed to assume she's talking about? Herself, right? That's what it sounds like, right? If I go with you, the glory is going to go to a woman. So she's saying, okay, well, I'm going to get the glory. But that's actually not what she means. There's going to be a plot twist here. And so you read the story itself, and the battle actually goes very quickly to where we actually get to see that Barak does end up winning the battle, and Sisera and his troops, they begin to flee. Whenever you get to Judges chapter 5, you actually get to read a song that Deborah sings after the battle, and we get to learn a little bit more details. And it turns out that the reason why the battle was won so quickly is because it started to rain. And do you know the effect that rain has on chariots?
Not good.
They're gonna get stuck in the mud.
They're going to get stuck in the mud, which basically renders chariots useless. And so, here, these things that they trusted in have now led to their defeat, right? It's almost like you just need to trust in Yahweh, right? Some trust in horses and chariots. We trust in the name of Yahweh, right? And so, the rain starts falling, the chariots get stuck, and the Canaanites, they have to flee. And so Sisera, he ditches, and he is fleeing for his life, and he comes to the tent of this woman who he assumes, like her husband is an ally, right? So this woman, her name is Jael. Her husband's name is Heber, I believe it is. Yeah, Heber the Kenite. And from Sisera's perspective, Heber and Jael are allies. And Heber's not there at the time. And so Sisera comes in and he says, Jael, I need you to help me out. I am on the run from the Israelites. I just lost this battle and I just need someplace to lay low for a little bit and I need to get some rest. And so Jael says, sure, come on in. Just come on in. You want some water? You know what? I'll give you some milk. I'll give you some warm milk. It'll be great. You can take a nap. It'll be awesome. So Sisera comes in. He drinks some milk. He lays down to take a nap. And while he's sleeping, Jael comes out. She grabs a tent peg and drives it through the guy's head. Ben's laughing at this, but this is a graphic scene. Right? Like, this is one of the most gnarly scenes in all Scripture. It doesn't get much more violent than this. Right? You have a woman driving a tent peg through a man's head. Right? And it says that she went all the way through until it stuck into the ground on the other side. Right? So that's very violent, but that's what Deborah meant when she said the glory was going to go to a woman. Yes?
The reason why I'm laughing is because whenever I think of Sarah, I think of this story with the tent peg. You know, Jael drives the tent peg into...
When do you think of Sarah?
I think of Sisera.
Oh, Sisera.
Yeah.
Okay.
Sisera.
Yeah. And so, we read that God subdued on that day Jabin the king of Canaan before the sons of Israel. The hand of the sons of Israel pressed heavier and heavier upon Jabin the king of Canaan until they destroyed Jabin the king of Canaan. Right? So now that Sisera has been destroyed, the Israelites are able to ultimately conquer Canaan. And then you read Judges chapter 5, and like I mentioned, Deborah begins to sing a song where she praises God for his victory. And it is one of the coolest songs ever. It's just such a very beautiful, amazing song. And one thing I just want to highlight is the end of this song has always been very sad to me. Because the way that the song actually ends is with... Like people will debate about how Deborah is singing this. Whether she's singing it in a mocking tone or in a sympathetic tone. I like to think she's singing it sympathetically. But she's reflecting on the mother of Sisera. Right? So remember, Sisera is the enemy commander whose head has been drilled through with a tent peg. Right? And this is what she says at the end of her song about Sisera's mother. Out of the window, she looked and lamented, the mother of Sisera through the lattice. Why does his chariot delay in coming? Why do the hoofbeats of his chariots tarry? Her wise princesses would answer her. Indeed, she repeats her words to herself. Are they not finding? Are they not dividing the spoil? A maiden, 2 maidens for every warrior. To Sisera, a spoil of dyed work, a spoil of dyed work embroidered, dyed work of double embroidery on the neck of the spoiler. Thus let all your enemies perish, O Yahweh. But let those who love him be like the rising of the sun in its might. To me, I feel like the song ends on a very bittersweet moment. She imagines the mother of Sisera sitting at a window, looking out, waiting for her little boy to return. And from this mother's perspective, she can't even come to fathom the idea that her little boy is dead. Instead, she assumes, if he's taken so long, the victory must have been so great that he's plundering all the booty, right? He's just got too much treasure. He's got too much riches that it's just taking him way too long to get home. And you have this mother who's in denial over her son's death. And I think that on one hand, Deborah is lamenting the heartache that comes from like just evil, right? I mean, because yes, Sisera was killed and he was justly killed, but also he had a mother, right? And like that's something that we fail to think. Like whenever we think of like whenever we make people just our enemy, we fail to realize the humanity behind them, right? And even whenever a villain is killed, there's a family or there are friends of those villains who are going to mourn that person. And that's something that we should realize, right? Like even whenever a horrible sinner is killed, that still represents evil in the world, right? But then the way the song actually ends is not with her just saying that. She says, thus let your enemies perish, O Yahweh, right? So Deborah isn't saying, I wish that Sisera hadn't died. She says, no, I hope the enemies of Yahweh perish because it's justice. But all because it's justice doesn't take away the sorrow that comes from the evil, right? And so to me, when you read that, the whole idea is it's saying we should rejoice in justice, but we should not rejoice in death, right? So Sisera's death is a sad thing, but the justice brought about by his death is a good thing, right? So it's teaching us as Christians to be more mindful of how we handle things, right? We want, it's hate the sinner. Love the sinner, hate the sin, right? She hates what Sisera did, but she still laments Sisera's death itself. However, she still wishes that fate on anybody who would oppose Yahweh. But that doesn't take away the pain that comes towards the people who have to lament that death, right? And so I think it's a very sober-minded way to approach this. You would think that the people of Israel would learn from all of their mistakes so far, but they still do not. And so when you get to Judges chapter 6, we actually get a lengthy account of a judge who is really going to be the turning point in this story, right? Because I would argue that Othniel, Ehud, and Deborah were all really good people, right? For Othniel, Ehud, and Deborah, they're all good people. It's the circumstances around themselves that are getting increasingly worse, right? Othniel is a very short story, right? Ehud, it was a weird story. And in Deborah, you literally have a commander of the army who's not willing to trust in God. And so his glory goes to a Kenite, right? Somebody who's not even Israelite, right? Just a Gentile woman has victory for the sake of Israel. When you get to Gideon, though, in chapter 6 through 9, this is where the story takes a turn, because I would say that Gideon is the definition of mid, right? He's not good, he's not bad, he's got moments of goodness and moments of being bad, but really he's there. What happens is the people turn and they start worshiping other gods again, and so God hands them into the hands of the Midianites, right? Midian is, once again, this is the place where Moses went and stayed for 40 years. Whenever he encountered the burning bush and stuff like that, he was staying in Midian. Well, the Midianites oppress Israel. The people of Israel cry out to God, and so God raises up Gideon. Whenever we encounter Gideon, he is threshing wheat in the middle of a valley, which is really ironic because usually you would thresh wheat up on a hilltop because it's the easiest place to do that because the wind would catch it and it makes it easier to separate the wheat from the chaff and all that stuff. The only reason you would thresh wheat in a valley is because you were afraid of people seeing you. And so he's afraid of the Midianites, and he's afraid of what they're going to do to him. And so here he is down on the bottom of a valley, and God shows up to him and says, "Greetings, O mighty man of valor." In many ways, it's like God is kind of mocking him a little bit, because here he is, a scaredy cat threshing wheat in the valley, and God calls him, "What's up, O fearless man?" It's very funny.
So it's like he's mocking him?
A little bit, yeah. And so God shows up to Gideon, and he basically tells Gideon, "Hey, I am going to appoint you to go and deliver my people." And Gideon is very hesitant about this, but eventually Gideon is going to give in. Let me check something real quick before I keep talking. Okay. So Gideon does ultimately give in to what God says, and I'm condensing a lot of this down because, once again, this is a bunch of chapters. Gideon does give in, and the very first thing that Gideon does is he goes and he tears down, in the middle of the night, he tears down an altar dedicated to Baal. Right? Baal is the Canaanite god. It is the god of storms. And Gideon goes, he tears down this altar, and whenever people wake up in the morning, they are furious. And they're like, "Who does this person think he is? How dare you tear down our altar?" And Gideon's dad actually comes out and says, "Hey, let Baal contend for himself." Right? If Baal has been offended by this, maybe Baal can come defend himself and he can take out my son. And Baal doesn't do anything. And so Gideon is given a nickname, which is Jeru-Baal, which just means let Baal contend for himself. And so God continues to communicate to Gideon that he is going to deliver Israel through his hands. And so God says to Gideon, "If you will deliver Israel through me, as you have spoken, behold, I will put a fleece of wool on the threshing floor. If there is dew on the fleece only, and it is dry on all the ground, then I will know that you will deliver Israel through me as you have spoken." So what Gideon does is, once again, we get to see that he is very hesitant. He doesn't trust God yet, right? And This is where you're seeing the cracks in the armor, right? He is testing God, right? God has literally shown up to him, and he says, God, you know what? All right, if you're really going to work through me, prove it. So he fleeces God, right? What I mean by that is he takes out a piece of fleece, he lays it on the threshing floor where you thresh the wheat, and he says, God, if I wake up in the morning and the fleece is wet and the ground is dry, well, then I'll know that you've spoken through me. Or that you have spoken to me and that you're going to work through me. Well, he wakes up and guess what he sees? The fleece is wet, the ground is dry. Awesome. But for Gideon, that's not enough. Because you could think how he's going to justify this in his head. He's like, oh, well, you know what? Maybe that's just how it works. Like, I don't know the evaporation rate when it comes to fleece and ground, and maybe the fleece just absorbs more water than the ground does, and so who's to say this is supernatural? He says, you know what, God? Let's reverse it, right? Tomorrow morning, if I come out here and the fleece is dry and the ground is wet, then I will know that you're going to work through me. And sure enough, that's what happens. And so finally Gideon's like, oh, okay, I guess I'll do it. Right, so Gideon follows in the footsteps of Moses, a very reluctant vessel of God. Right? And so Gideon, he finally gives in, he amasses an army, and he gets together 32,000 people to go and fight the Midianites. And guess what God tells him?
Too many.
There's too many. Which is ironic because, I mean, what commander ever has that problem? I mean, usually the whole goal is, like the thing is you have too little people in your army. But according to God, it's not about the size, right? This is something that we've emphasized in Joshua and in Judges, right? The whole point with God is that it's about faithfulness. It is not about how big your army is. You simply need me. And so, Gideon goes out and says, all right, if anybody's afraid to go to battle, leave. Guess how many of the 32,000 leave? 22,000 leave. 2/3 of the army, they're like, yeah, we were afraid of this. And so they just leave. They dip. Only 10,000 remain. So now we're down to 1/3 of the size of the army. And guess what God says?
Still too many.
Still too big. He says, I don't need 10,000 people either. Ultimately, there's only going to be 300 men. Right? So basically, there's this whole other test involving water and stuff like that. And people will read into it like, ooh, why did God choose these people and not these people? I think the main thing is that God wanted to choose the smaller group. Right? God wanted only 300 people because he wanted to prove he doesn't need a big army. He started off with 32,000. He cut that down to 300. That is 1% of the size of the original army.
Wow.
And he says, all right, let's do it. And so, when you get to the end of Judges chapter 7, you actually get to see how the battle goes down. And it turns out that the Israelites didn't really have to do that much. Right? Basically, they are given these clay pots and torches. They split into 3 different camps, and they surround the Midianite encampment. And in the middle of the night, they break the pots. They start screaming and all this stuff. And God sends the Midianites into a confusion. And the Midianites literally start killing themselves. Right? They wake up in the middle of the night. They assume they're being attacked. And they, it's dark. They're surrounded by like a ring of fire. And they just start slashing. And they start killing each other. And then they eventually start fleeing. And Gideon chases them down. And so they've got 300 people. They have this huge, amazing victory. And this basically sets up the rest of Gideon's story to where he ends up just being this major, major success. So that through Gideon, there are 40 years of peace in the land. And by the time you get to the end of Gideon's time as judge, the people are saying, hey, we want to make you king. And Gideon responds in one of what seems to be, at face value, what seems to be one of the most humble responses ever. He says, guys, I can't be your king. Yahweh alone is your king, and him only shall you serve, which sounds really, really good. But then he says, however, if you want to give me a bunch of money, I will take that. And if you'll let me marry a bunch of women, I'll do that too. And if you let me have a bunch of kids, I'll do that as well. What are those things? Who does things like that?
King.
Kings.
That's what
And then
warned them not to do.
Exactly.
Multiply wealth in women.
Yeah.
Like he hasn't done is multiply chariots.
Yeah. It's almost like Gideon, he rejects the title so that he can do the things without being called king. Yeah, no. So Gideon's like, no, you shall not make me king. Only God shall be your king. Sounds really pious on the outside. But then he does all the things that kings do. Right? And to make matters worse, he has a son. You know what he names his son? Abimelech. You know what Abimelech means? My father is king. This is what I'm saying when I say Gideon, he's not great. Right? So he's got some really good moments. But this is where we start seeing the chinks in the armor. And sure enough, the people gave Gideon a bunch of jewelry and stuff, and he makes this like golden ephod thing, a really cool like breastplate. And that ends up becoming a snare to the people and leading them into idolatry. So, yes, he delivered them from the Midianites, but by the end of his ministry, he delivered them into something else, which is not good. When you read Judges chapter 9, we're no longer talking about Gideon himself, but we're talking about his son. Because guess what? Abimelech, his dad might not have wanted the title king, but Abimelech has no qualms about it. Abimelech decides that he wants to become king, and when you read this chapter, you get to see all the heinous things that he does in order to claim the throne for himself. So you read through the chapter, and this guy literally he's terrible, right? He literally just starts going throughout the land, just killing one person after another. Just whoever's an obstacle in his way, he takes them out. And the only way that Abimelech's story ends is actually him laying siege to a town. And there's a tower up on top of the town that everybody's fled into. And a woman picks up a stone, casts it over the side of the tower, and it lands on Abimelech's head and cracks his skull. And so Abimelech is laying on the ground, and this will show you his priorities, right? He literally looks over and says to his armor bearer dude, he's like, hey, come and kill me with your sword so that people will not say after I'm dead that I was killed by a woman. One thing, and whenever we went week by week through Judges, we emphasize this. One thing that you'll notice as society degrades in the book of Judges, so also the treatment of women degrades too. And I think this is true in any society. As society degrades, the role of women is also, like women are increasingly objectified, right? So at the beginning of Judges, you have Deborah, the judge of Israel, right? She's this amazing woman. Here, this dude's embarrassed to be killed by a woman. By the end, women are going to be either kidnapped just to help, just marry off to other guys, or they're going to be cut up into pieces to kick off civil war, right? So women are increasingly objectified over the course of the book. By the time you get to Jephthah, chapters 10 through 12, God is really fed up with the people, right? And at this point, the Ammonites have been sent in to oppress the people because of their idolatry, and the people cry out to God, and they say, God, we need a judge. We need somebody. And God says, you know what? Go find one for yourselves. Right? Like, I'm tired of y'all. Like, y'all are ridiculous. And so they end up finding a guy, and he is the scum of the earth. Right? Jephthah, not a great dude. Right? This guy, he's just, he hangs around with the wrong crowd. He's very good at getting a job done. Right? He's a very good warrior, but he's just not great. And the main story you need to know with Jephthah is that he makes a stupid promise he should have never made. He's going off to battle against the Ammonites, and before the battle, he prays this prayer to God. And he says, oh God, if you are faithful and you are with me in battle, and if you give me victory over the Ammonites, then I vow to give to you on a sacrifice the very first thing that walks out of the house of the very first thing to walk through my doorway whenever I return home.
Oh, yeah.
Yes?
And I know who comes through that doorway.
Yes.
His daughter.
Yep. Spoiler alert.
I know.
So, he goes off to battle, and sure enough, he wins. And he comes back, and lo and behold, who comes through the doorway? His daughter. Right? His young virgin daughter, probably 12 or 13 years old. She sees that her dad's back home from battle. Daddy! She runs over to him, and he realizes he's made a big boo-boo. The thing is, he didn't need to make it, right? There was no, he set himself up for failure. He was trying to look pious, but the thing is, he treated Yahweh like a pagan god. Because, y'all, remember, to obey is better than sacrifice, right? That's what we're going to read in 1 Samuel, right? God doesn't simply want sacrifice. But he was treating Yahweh like a pagan god, saying, if you do this for me, I'll do this for you. If you will give me victory, I'll give you a sacrifice. But God doesn't want that. God just wants your faithfulness, right? You should give a sacrifice out of love for him and obedience, not out of trying to earn something. So that's where Jephthah went wrong. But also, he just made a stupid promise. He didn't need to make it, right? Or if he was going to make the promise, because God didn't ask for this, right? But in addition to that, he could have been more specific. He could have said the very first animal, but he was vague, right? He set himself up for failure. And so, play a stupid game, win stupid prizes, right? This daughter was his only child, and it's actually really sad. Also, here we once again have degradation of women, right? This young girl ends up being, a sacrifice. And she has to ask, she says, hey, she understands that once you've made a vow to God, you better keep it. So good for her. She says, Dad, you need to do this. She says, just give me some time for me and my girlfriends to go up in the mountains and weep over my virginity. And what she means by that is basically her and her friends are just going to go into the mountains and cry over the fact that she's never going to get married, never have kids, never get to actually have a life. That her life is going to be taken from her before she's even had a chance to experience it. So it's a very sad, sobering moment. And so she goes and does that, and it even tells us that to this day, the people continued to do that. And then you read some more stories of Jephthah in chapter 10. In chapters 11 and 12. But for the sake of time, let's talk about the last judge, Samson. Because Samson, oh my Lord, this guy is a total trash bag. Right? Samson, the reason why he's reserved for last, the reason why I have him in dark red there, is because he is the classic case of really God's grace, honestly. We get to see how God is able to work through even the most vile people in order to accomplish his good purposes. Right? And you also get the impression that this is the best Israel had to offer at this time. And so Samson is bad. Bad, bad, bad. But his story starts off with a lot of promise. Whenever you read Judges chapter 13, you actually don't read about Samson at all. You read about the announcement of his birth. Right? The only other person whose birth was announced ahead of time so far in Scripture is Isaac. Right? And so Samson begins with a lot of promise, where God literally shows up and he says, I'm going to appoint this man who is going to be a Nazirite lifelong. A Nazirite vow is something that you could take according to the Torah if you were really wanting to dedicate yourself to God. Usually it would be like a temporal thing. There were 3 requirements. You couldn't cut your hair, you couldn't drink alcohol, and you couldn't touch a dead body. Right? And if you did those 3 things, that was basically like your way of being set apart for God to really focus on him for a certain amount of time. Well, Samson is going to be a Nazirite his entire life. Right? So he literally exists to be set apart for God, but over the course of the story, he is going to break all 3 of those commands. So that by the time he gets to the end of the story, the only one that's going to matter is his hair being cut, because that's the only one he hadn't done. But this dude is going to be this amazing figure who's going to deliver the Israelites from the Philistines. But as we read the story, we're going to see he doesn't deliver them intentionally. He delivers them by accident. Right? Every single time Samson delivers the people, it's not because he was being faithful to Yahweh. It was because he was throwing a temper tantrum and just going nuts. So it kind of reads a little bit different that way. Right? He delivers the people by accident. And that's what God's having to work with. And so Samson is born, and you get an idea of what Samson's problem is going to be very early on. Chapter 14, verse 1. Then Samson went down to Timnah and saw a woman in Timnah, one of the daughters of the Philistines. So he came back and told his father and his mother, I saw a woman in Timnah, one of the daughters of the Philistines. Now therefore go get her for me as a wife. Okay, if you're a judge of Israel and the Philistines are oppressing you, what are you supposed to do to the Philistines?
You're supposed to judge them.
You're supposed to kill them.
Well, yeah.
Not marry them, right? But Samson, he says, hey, Mom, Dad, there's this really hot Philistine chick I'm really into. Let's marry her. And the parents are like, Samson, buddy, there's a bunch of fish in the sea. Couldn't you find one in, Israel? And Samson says, Mom, Dad, you don't understand. The heart wants what the heart wants. You can't cage a wild beast, It's like, I want to marry her. And so they eventually agree that he's going to marry her. And over the course of the chapter, what you read is that they have this wedding feast, and Samson gets into this debate with some of the Philistines there, probably because they're drunk, right? Which he's not supposed to drink alcohol. But they get into this debate, and they start having playing these different games at this wedding feast. And Samson gives them a riddle, and they can't figure out the answer to the riddle. And the reason why is because Samson does not, he's kind of cheating in the whole game. He gives them a riddle that they will not be able to solve because it's based off of something that he alone has experienced. So he's cheating at the game. He gives them a riddle. They can't solve it. And so they threaten the wife. And they say, if you don't figure out this riddle and tell us, we will kill you and your dad. And so the wife goes up to Samson and says, do you even love me? How can we even have a relationship if there's no trust? You need to talk to me. Communicate. This is not going to be the only time Samson has a woman say this to him. And so he says, okay, well, here's the answer to the riddle. Well, she goes and tells them the answer to the riddle. And so Samson loses the bet. Well, according to the bet, whoever lost the riddle had to give the other people clothes. So now Samson has to offer them a bunch of clothes, but he doesn't have that many clothes. So what does he do? He goes to a local Philistine town, kills a bunch of guys, steals their clothes, gives it to the people. Well, now people are like, well, hold up. We were having we were just having a fun time, and you just went and massacred people. Very quickly, we're going to see that Samson becomes a thorn in the Philistine side. He's a menace, and from their perspective, he is like the number one most wanted person who needs to be stopped. And so over the course of the story, we see this progress. Right? Samson, he gets really mad. He's mad at his wife. He leaves for a little bit. And most people would naturally assume that if a wedding feast ends in a massacre, the wedding's probably off. Not Samson, though. Right? A few days pass, and Samson decides that he is going to, he's going to go get his wife again. Right? But he realizes that last time he saw her, he did kind of kill a bunch of people, so he probably needs to make up for it. So he brings a goat. He's like, hey, I brought a goat. I'm sorry. Right? I guess goats were the equivalent of roses back in the day. And so Samson brings a goat. He's trying to make up for things. But there's an issue now because a lot of time has passed. And the wife, her dad, has married her off to somebody else. Uh-oh. Samson's not happy about this. That's my wife. What are you talking about? You did that. Well, what Samson ends up doing is that he throws an absolute temper tantrum. And because they were so thoughtless and careless about his feelings, he goes and catches hundreds of foxes. This dude is so over the top. He is so theatrical, so extra. He goes and catches all these foxes. He ties their tails together. He sets their tails on fire and sends them running throughout the fields to burn down all the crops of the Philistines. I mean, he could have easily just gone and burned down the fields himself if he did that. But no, this dude is over the top. And so he killed, not only is he killing Philistines, he's destroying their economy as well. These people are like, this guy needs to be stopped. They get mad, so what they go and do is they go and kill Samson's wife and the dad.
Wow. Yes, wow.
They're just making him even angrier, right? He's like the original Incredible Hulk. You won't like me when I'm angry, right? He is. I also compare him a little bit to Jack from The Incredibles, right? Like he's got the mentality of a baby, but he's got way too much power. And so Samson, he's just getting so mad about all this stuff, and he throws a temper tantrum. He flees away, and it says he just goes and sits at like a cliff, like just hangs out like in a cave. Well, eventually the Israelites come to get him because the Philistines have like a warrant out for Samson's arrest because he's been murdering everybody. And the Israelites are like, "Hey, Samson, buddy, the Philistines kind of want you, and they want you like imprisoned. So can we like take you to them?" And he's like, "Sure, whatever, I don't care." So they like tie his hands in like ropes. They bring him over to the Philistines, and then Samson just like breaks out of the ropes because Samson is. Oh, I haven't mentioned this yet. He's super strong. Like this dude is buff. Like this dude is like he's a very strong man. He just rips out of the ropes out of nowhere. He sees a fresh donkey's jawbone laying on the side of the road. Don't know why that's there. He picks it up, and it says that he killed 1,000 Philistines with a donkey's jawbone.
John Wick.
This is putting John Wick to shame. Yeah. He killed 1,000 guys with the jawbone of a donkey. That's wild. And then, if that weren't enough, in the middle of all this carnage, he starts singing a song. It says, "Then Samson said, with the jawbone of a donkey, heaps upon heaps. With the jawbone of a donkey, I've killed 1,000 men." And I would naturally be inclined to think, oh, maybe he wrote this a little bit later on, after everything had calmed down. No, then it says, when he had finished speaking, he threw the jawbone from his hand, and he named that place Ramath Lehi. So literally, here, just imagine the scene. You come across this dude surrounded by 1,000 corpses, dripping in blood, holding a donkey's jawbone, and he's just singing a song about how many people he just killed. Samson is unhinged. This dude is wild. But guess what's happening through him? The Philistines are being subdued. Right? So, he's got weird tactics, but it's happening. But he's not doing it out of faithfulness to Yahweh. He's doing it by accident because he's getting angry. The story progresses, and what we see is that one day Samson decides he wants to go sleep with a prostitute. So, of course, he goes and sleeps with a prostitute. And the people try to ambush him there, and they try to lock him in the city so that they can attack him. But then he just breaks outside the city, and once again, because he's extra, he rips the gate to the city off its hinges and marches it up a mountain and leaves the gate on top of the mountain just to make it harder for them to get the gate back down.
That's super duper strength.
It's super strength, but he's also just petty, right? He's just a very petty guy. He's just childish. And then eventually you get to the most famous story where Samson falls madly in love with a woman named Delilah. We don't know whether Delilah was Philistine or Israelite. Given his reputation, probably Philistines. It seems like he just really loved them. And he falls in love with Delilah, and he just loves her so much. And the Philistines realize that women are Samson's weakness. And so they bribe Delilah and say, hey, we'll pay you 1,000 silver coins to betray Samson. And for Delilah, this is obviously, yeah, I'm going to do that because, by comparison, Judas betrayed Jesus for 30 silver coins. Delilah's getting paid 1,000. She's like, yeah, okay, yeah, I'll hand him over to you. And so, for several nights in a row, Delilah tries to discern Samson's secret. And Samson, at the beginning of the story, you think he's pretty smart. Because he's like, no, I'm not going to tell you my secret. He doesn't tell her that, but he lies to her, right? To him, it's almost like a game, right? He's like, oh, well, if you do this to me, I would be weak. But then she does it, and you'd think that he would begin to question her motives. Right? Because he goes to bed and then she says, Samson, the Philistines are upon you. And then it turns out he had lied to her, and so he still has strength and he's able to subdue the Philistines. But then she keeps doing this on several occasions. And it seems like he's smart enough to realize, oh, she's deceiving me. But for some reason, he's still with her. Mm-hmm. And then she pulls the same card that his wife had pulled. How can we even have trust in this relationship if you're not willing to tell me the source of your strength? Do you even love me? You keep using that word, but do you even know what love is? And so Samson finally gives in. He says, if you were to cut my hair, I would be as weak as any other man. And so she does it. She cuts his hair, and lo and behold, Samson, the Philistines are upon you, and he's as weak as any other man. I do not know what made Samson tell her the secret. This dude seemed to just be stupid. I have no idea. Right? He should have known better. But he is weak as any other man, and as a result, he is captured by the Philistines. His eyes are plucked out, and he is made a slave. But he's not done yet, because one day the Philistines throw a party, they bring Samson out, and they decide to use him as a party guest, right? We were talking about jesters and stuff before we started the discipleship group tonight. And they kind of bring him out as just they're wanting to mock him in the temple. And so thousands of people are in attendance. They bring out Samson, and, here you've got this blind guy who used to be super strong. And he used to be this wanted criminal, but now they can just mock him and probably throw tomatoes at him and stuff. And Samson finally prays and says, God, give me strength one final time. Finally, at the very end of his story, Samson shows a glimmer of hope. And he says, God, give me strength one final time. And they've positioned him between these two pillars, right? So he can support himself because he's blind. And God gives him strength to heave the pillars, and the whole temple falls down. And thousands of Philistines are killed. And so we read that Samson killed more Philistines in his death than he killed in his life, because Samson obviously died when the temple fell upon him as well as everybody else. And so the Samson story is very interesting right here, because you get to see how bad things have gotten. Right? Samson, the reason we talk about him so much is because his story is so interesting and compelling. But it's compelling because of how crazy it is. Right? Whenever you're a little kid, especially as a boy, it's like, oh, I want to be Samson. You do not want to be Samson.
Yep, you don't.
Right? Samson is a story of God's grace because it shows that God can still work with you when you're that bad, but you don't want to be like him. right? And so as you read the stories of the Judges, you get to see Israel's culture falling apart more and more and more. Which then leads to these last 4 chapters here, or 17, 18, 19, 20, like 5 chapters, right? And these stories are very, very interesting. I would encourage you to read them on your own. We're not going to go into them right now. The main thing that you need to know is that in chapters 17 and 18, Israel turns to idolatry, and specifically the tribe of Dan is the very first one to lead them into idolatry. And the tribe of Dan, they migrate north, and they capture a city which they then call Dan, which becomes the northernmost boundary of Israel. Right? That's chapter 17 and 18. Chapter 19, we get, like I mentioned earlier, what seems to be a replay of the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. But it takes place in the city of Gibeah of Benjamin, which is going to be relevant for us when we get to 1 Samuel. Because in 1 Samuel, there's going to be a king who is elected as the first king of Israel, and he's going to be from Gibeah of Benjamin. So right off the bat, when you're introduced to this king, you know he's not a great guy because he is literally from the Sodom and Gomorrah of the Bible. Of Israel. Right? And so in chapter 19, you read about this Levite and this concubine, and they go to Gibeah, and the Sodom and Gomorrah type story takes place where they're wanting to rape the concubine. Or actually, they're wanting to rape the Levite. But if you remember the Sodom and Gomorrah story, where Lot wanted to throw his virgin daughters out, well, the Levite actually throws his concubine out. And also, a Levite has a concubine, which is a really big issue, right? And this woman ends up being assaulted, and if that weren't enough, like chapter 19 would already be a bad enough indictment against the people of Israel for what they're doing. I mean, they literally look like Sodom and Gomorrah, which whenever you think of Sodom and Gomorrah, you think of the picture of human evil, right? If that weren't enough, though, the Levite makes matters worse. Because rather than having compassion on his concubine, the Levite ends up cutting her body into 12 pieces, shipping it throughout the land to incite everybody into civil war, which leads to chapters 20 and 21, where everybody mounts up against the tribe of Benjamin to try to destroy them because of what they did, right? And so by the end of Judges, you have this massive civil war where the tribe of Benjamin is almost wiped out, and the only reason they aren't wiped out is because everybody realizes what they're doing. And they realize, oh crud, we have almost wiped out an entire tribe. We can't do this. And so what they end up doing is they go and kidnap some girls to marry off to the Benjamites so that the Benjamites can populate again. And so when you read all of Judges, you realize there is a problem. And towards the end of the book, the author himself gives us insight into his diagnosis of what that problem is. In those days, there was no king in Israel. Every man did what was right in his own eyes. If you know this single verse, you know the book of Judges. It is repeated several times throughout the end of the book, and this is the author's way of commentary. Right? He is saying the issue is that Israel didn't have a king. Which is ironic because in the book, you have somebody saying who the king should be. Who should the king be?
God.
Yahweh, right? Remember, that's what Gideon said in the middle of the book. He said, Yahweh should be your king. The issue is, they're not serving Yahweh as king. Right? Yahweh's supposed to be, but they're not serving him like that. Instead, they are taking every opportunity to serve somebody else. They will serve the other gods. They will serve Abimelech. Right? They will do whatever they want, but they won't serve Yahweh as king. And so the author seems to suggest maybe they need a king. Because people aren't good at serving what they can't see. So, the end result is everybody's doing what's right in their own eyes. God gave them a Torah, but they're not following it. Right? You don't really read about the Torah at all in Judges. And the Levites aren't really doing a much better job because the Levites have concubines. And they're bringing about civil war. Well, the Levites are the ones who should be protecting the Torah. And so we've got a really big issue here, which is going to pave the way for 1 Samuel, right? Because we're going to see the birth of the monarchy. But real quick, in just a few minutes to wrap up today, what I want to do is I want to summarize one happy story that we have in the midst of all this darkness. Because while the book of Judges will make you depressed if you're not too careful. Because in the book of Judges you get to see, man, God can give you literally everything you need and you will still turn away from him. Right? And even the holy people of God can look like Sodom and Gomorrah if they're not careful. Which is very, it should be eye-opening to us. And so Judges can make you very sad and depressed because I think there's so many implications about it in our own current lives, even as Christians. But the book of Ruth gives us a glimmer of hope in the midst of all this. And ultimately, the book of Ruth, as we read at the very end of the book, it's kind of it's a big plot twist at the end of the story. But the book of Ruth is the story of the great-grandmother of King David. And if the book of Judges ended by foreshadowing how evil King Saul is going to be, the book of Ruth exists to foreshadow how good King David's going to be. Right? So Saul comes from Gibeah of Benjamin, which is the new Sodom and Gomorrah of Israel. Whereas David is descended from Ruth, a Moabite, who were typically the enemies of Israel. But Ruth is no enemy. The way this story goes down is it's only 4 chapters long, super short. Basically, there's this woman named Naomi who, her and her husband, they decide to flee the land of Israel during a time of famine. If there's famine in the land, what does that suggest about what's going on there?
That they're not serving God.
They're not serving God, right? Which is no surprise because this book tells us, like literally the very first words are, now it came about in the days when the judges judged. Or in the time period of the judges. So we know that this is a time period when the land is like, whenever the people are not faithful to God. And so, there's a famine in the land, which shouldn't surprise us. Because that means that the people have been unfaithful. Well, Naomi and her husband, they decide to leave. And so they leave with their 2 sons. They go into the land of Moab. Whether or not they should have done that, probably not. But they go and do it anyways. And the 2 sons get married. But over the course of time, Naomi's husband and the 2 sons all die, leaving Naomi and her 2 daughters-in-law as widows. Right? It's Naomi and then her 2 daughters-in-law, Orpah and Ruth. Well, over the course of time, Naomi decides, you know what? Living in Moabite land as a widow is not going to work out for me. I need to go back home. Right? I need to go back home because at least there maybe somebody will provide for me. Right? If I'm going to be a widow, it's better to be a widow in the land of Israel where we do have, hypothetically, this Torah which will provide for widows and orphans. Right? So she says, I'm going to go back to land. And Ruth and Orpah decide to go with her. And they start following her. And Naomi says, guys, y'all don't need to go with me. Right? Y'all are still young women. There's still a chance that y'all can get remarried. Y'all have an entire life over here. If you go with me into Israel, they're going to view you as outsiders, as enemies, as pagans. Right? If you go with me, you're going to give up your entire life. All chance you have of a future is gone. And that's a fair point. So Orpah, one of the widows, she says, that's fair, and she leaves. And the Bible doesn't judge her for that. That's a valid thing to do. But Ruth, oh my Lord, Ruth is amazing. Ruth says, where you go, I go. Where you stay, I stay. Your people will be my people. Your God will be my God. And so Ruth says, Naomi, I'm here for you. And the thing is, Ruth doesn't have anything to gain from this. Right? She is literally forsaking all hopes of a future just because of her love towards Naomi. Her hesed. Right? She says, Naomi, I don't care about what I have to get out of it. I'm here for you. Because she sees all that Naomi has lost. And she says, I want to be there for you. So she goes with Naomi back to Naomi's hometown of Bethlehem. They go to Bethlehem, and while they're there, Naomi's bitter at all of this, right? She changed her name. She says, don't call me Naomi anymore, call me Mara. Because Mara means bitter. Because she says, God has dealt bitterly with me. But Ruth wants to make the best of the situation, so she ends up going, and now that there's grain in the land, Bethlehem literally means house of bread, so if there was food, Bethlehem would have it. Ruth ends up going, and she begins to glean the fields. And it just so happens that she ends up in the field of a man named Boaz. And Boaz is probably an older guy, very wealthy guy. And turns out he is also a very good dude. Right? And this is all just highlighting that not everything's bad in Judges. Right? There's a lot of bad stuff going on, but there are some good people. Boaz is one of them. And Boaz, he's heard about Ruth. It's hard. She's a Moabite, so she looks different. She probably wears different types of jewelry. She probably just looks different. Everybody's heard about what she's done for Naomi. And others might look down on Ruth, but Boaz, he has respect for her. And so he tells everybody, I want you to provide for that woman. Right? I want you to leave behind some extra grain for her to pick up. And he provides extra grain for her. Some people will read like romantic overtones into this. I don't think that's what you're supposed to do. I think Boaz is just a good dude providing for her. But as a reader, you can't help but want them to get together. Because you're reading it, you're like, ooh, she's cool, he's cool. How cool would it be if this worked out? Right? So like I don't think from his perspective, he had no reason to think that this would ever happen. But as a reader, you're kind of like, I like where this is headed. And so Ruth eventually goes back to Naomi, and she tells her about how everything's going at the fields. And she says that she was at a field of a guy named Boaz. And Naomi's like, hold up, what? Boaz? I know who Boaz is. Boaz is a close relative of ours. And according to the Torah, if a woman's husband dies without providing an heir, then the closest male relative can marry that woman to provide an heir to preserve the family line. That person's known as a kinsman redeemer. She says, Boaz is our kinsman redeemer. Ruth, do you understand the implications of this? You could marry Boaz, and you might still have a future, and the family line might be preserved. This is exciting. And so, Naomi tells Ruth to do what any mother would tell her daughter-in-law to do at this point. She says, all right, what you need to do, you need to doll yourself up. You need to put on some makeup. You need to make yourself smell nice. And you're going to go approach Boaz. But the timing of when she approaches Boaz is going to be kind of weird. She goes and visits Boaz in the middle of the night when he's asleep at the threshing floor. She goes there, and this is a very kind of intense moment because the conversation she needs to have with him is a conversation that needs to be done in private because she's going to be asking a lot of him. But if anybody else, there's other men around here, right? If anybody else wakes up and sees this conversation happening, they're going to assume that something way different is happening. Because here you have a young girl, a young foreign girl, at this dude's feet. It's going to look kind of sexual, right? And so it could ruin both her and his reputation immediately if they get caught. But they need to have this conversation. So she goes there, she lays down silently, and then in the middle of the night, Boaz wakes up, he sees Ruth, and he says, Ruth, what are you doing here? He's kind of like, what are you doing here? This is not the time. What's happening? And Ruth voices their proposal, right? I was talking with Naomi, and Naomi said that you are our kinsman redeemer. And Boaz is flattered. He says, wow, the fact that you would even consider me for something like that, that's amazing, and I really appreciate it. And you get the idea that he wants to do this. But he says there is an issue. He says that there's actually one person who is a closer relative to you than I am. Which could suggest that maybe he had already kind of looked into this a bit because he seems to know off the top of his head who the closer relative is. I don't know. But he says there is a closer relative. But he says, but don't you worry about this. If you're serious about this, first thing in the morning, I will go take care of this. And so he gives her reassurance that he'll figure it out. And he even gives her extra grain for her to leave with, right? So Boaz is just a great guy. And so sure enough, the next morning, Boaz goes and tracks down the other guy, and they gather together at the gate of the city. The gate of the city is where all public things would be handled. And Boaz says, hey, dude, so you might have heard about Naomi and her situation, how she went off and her husband died and all that stuff. Well, you're her kinsman redeemer, and that means that all of the husband's stuff goes to you. Like the land, the possessions, all of it, that is all now yours for the taking. Does that sound good to you? And the dude says, heck yeah, sounds good. I mean, free real estate? Absolutely, sign me up. And then Boaz says, oh, I forgot to mention one part. You see, Naomi, her son had a wife, and she's a Moabite. And so if you are going to be the kinsman redeemer, you would also have to marry the Moabite Ruth. And this is where the guy's tune changes. Oh, a Moabite, huh? Yikes. I'll be good. I think I'll pass on that one. Right? So the guy sounded really gung-ho for it at first, but all of a sudden, when he hears about, the Moabite, it's like, ooh, change of tune. And so he says, no, I can't do this. And so, now that the guy's turned it down, who does it go to? Boaz. Right? And so, long story short, Boaz and Ruth end up getting married. Boaz serves as the kinsman redeemer. And Naomi is no longer bitter anymore. Right? And the way that the story ends is not with Ruth, but the story actually ends with Naomi. And Naomi is holding Ruth's baby in her hands. And we read this. So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife, and he went into her. And Yahweh enabled her to conceive, and she gave birth to a son. Then the woman said to Naomi, Blessed is Yahweh, who has not left you without a redeemer today, and may his name become famous in Israel. May he also be to you a restorer of life and a sustainer of your old age. For your daughter-in-law, who loves you and is better to you than 7 sons, has given birth to him. Then Naomi took the child and laid him in her lap and became his nurse. The neighbor women gave him a name, saying, A son has been born to Naomi. So they named him Obed. He is the father of Jesse, the father of David. So the story ends not with Ruth, but with Naomi holding this child. The story began with Naomi experiencing death all around. But it ends with Naomi holding new life in her hand. Right? So it began in a state of hopelessness, but it ended with this promise of hope. Which in many ways is a good transition from the book of Judges into 1 Samuel. Right? Because when you read Judges, death and decay are everywhere. But when you get into 1 Samuel, there's almost like this promise of resurrection. Right? So that even whenever things are at the darkest, God can raise beauty from the ashes. Right? And so Ruth, in the Hebrew Bible, Ruth is actually found later on because it's set with other books. But where we put it in here, we put it chronologically. And it's a good transition. Right? Because it sets up, yes, the time period of the Judges is a dark place, but in the ashes that Judges leaves behind, new life is going to be born, kind of like a phoenix rising from the ashes. In many ways, the book of Judges is kind of like a forest that has been burnt down by a fire, but the fire burns away all the impurities so that the forest can be more fruitful than ever before. That's kind of what we're reading here, right? And so at the end of the story, we get to see why the story was shared to begin with, because you're like, why are we reading about some random Moabite woman and working the fields of some random dude in Bethlehem? Well, it's because this random Moabite woman is no random Moabite woman. She's the great-grandmother of King David, right? And so, yes, King David, he might not be of fully Jewish blood, right? He's got Moabite, the enemy, running in his veins. But he's got Hesed running in his veins, too. King Saul, he's descended from the Sodom-like Gibeonites. Or Gibeaites. Not Gibeon. Gibeaites. Benjamites, right? That's what King Saul is descended from. But David, he's descended from a line of Hesed, right? The Hesed that Boaz showed Ruth, the Hesed that Ruth showed Naomi, the Hesed that God showed all of them, right? That's what David's descended from, which will pave the way for next week, where we will enter into 1 Samuel by talking about Samuel, the final judge. Sound good? Mm-hmm. One of y'all want to close it out in prayer?
I'll do it.
You want to do?
I'll go ahead and do it.
Go for it.
Dear Heavenly Father, thank you so much for bringing us here together to study your word and help us, God, to apply it out there in the real world. Help us to be your, get your word and hear what you want us to do and go apply it. And, thank you, God, for showing us that in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.
Amen.